mentioned, I'm the new Dave Crowley. I'm the area biologist at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game here, working in Prince William Sound and all of Unit 6, which goes all the way over to Icy Bay. And but before that, I worked in the Caribou office of Fish and Game as the area biologist there. And I was one of 2 biologists based out of that office. I focused on almost everything with hooves and claws, terrestrial mammals, including muskox, sheep, moose, brown bears, black bears, all of that. And then the other biologist was the research biologist for the Western Arctic caribou herd. And as one of 2 biologists there, I got to go with him and do the work that we do, that the Alaska Department of Fish and Game does, monitoring that herd. So I spent the last 5 years mostly in the back of a Super Cup, looking at Western Arctic caribou, studying them, thinking about them. The biologist there, his name is Jim Dow, and he's one of the foremost experts on caribou in the world. He's been living in Kotzebue for 30 years, studying that caribou herd, and is just a very knowledgeable resource about the Western Arctic caribou herd. It's the largest caribou herd in the state of Alaska, and right now it's the largest caribou herd in North America. But like all caribou populations in the world right now, it's on a bit of a decline. So the goal of my presentation tonight is basically just increase the awareness about this tremendous resource and give you an idea of its magnitude, because it faces a number of different development pressures that we all need to be educated about, get information about as we evaluate what's going to be compatible with this tremendous resource. So I just want to give you a little bit of information about the herd, but mainly I just want to show you a GWOW presentation with a bunch of really cool pictures. Generally, my presentations are pretty heavy in numbers and statistics and graphs. I'm going to go really easy on the numbers and have no graphs and no statistics to hopefully just make this presentation a bit more enjoyable, and just because there are far better people to teach you about those things or to give you information about those. So I'll give you a little more information about that as we go along. So without further ado, a little bit of caribou tales and trails. So the Western Arctic caribou herd is like all caribou populations. It goes through these oscillations over time that are relative to its range condition. We started monitoring the Western Arctic caribou herd in the 1970s, and at the time it was at a low point. In 1976, we estimated about 75,000 caribou, and most everyone agrees that was probably a low estimate at the time. We were just developing the techniques that we use today, and they were pretty primitive. We had a pretty low number of callers in the population, and so there's pretty much agreement that 75,000 is a low estimate, but everyone can agree that the herd was very, very depleted at that time for probably a variety of different reasons. From 1976 to 1990, it grew at about 13% annually. That's a pretty impressive growth rate. So what we saw, and then that growth rate slowed down from 1990 to 2003. It was pretty stable. It only grew at 1 to 3% annually, which is still growing. In 2003, we estimated the herd at about 490,000 animals, and it could have been more than that because we don't look at the caribou herd every year. When the caribou herd's really doing well, we look at it every 3 years. When it's on a decline, we look at it every 2 years. So it may have been at its highest point in the year prior, or 2 years prior, or year after. We're not really sure. But sometime around 2003, it was very high. It was at 490,000. Since that time, we estimate that it's on about a 4 to 6% annual decline. And there are a variety of different reasons why we think this might be happening, but there's no smoking gun at this time, and that's part of why there's really nothing we can do about it. Caribou populations worldwide are on a decline right now. Very few populations are not declining. Some of the different reasons why we think this might be happening are related to global climate change and the increased prevalence of rain on snow events. The caribou live and die by their feet, and if their tundra becomes covered with a thick sheet of ice that they can't paw through, it can just make it get to the point where they're burning more calories trying to get food than they're getting from the food once they access it. So it may not be so much, when a herd is naturally oscillating, it's doing that because of the range condition and the quality of its range condition. The herd will grow to a certain point, it will exhaust the range, it will crash subsequently. And so, but in this case, all of a studies we have about range characteristics say the range is doing fine. It may be somewhat depleted, but things like tundra fires that are happening with increased prevalence because of global climate change, these free rain on snow events that are happening, timing of migration that's being influenced by temperatures is potentially influencing their mortality. There's just a number of different factors. When you have a small herd, you can often use hunting pressure to prevent the animals from growing to a point that they reach the point where they're exhausting the range. But on a herd that's as large as the Western Arctic herd, short of machine gunning caribou and letting them lie, which no one would ever do, there's nothing we can do using hunting when the herd is big to keep it from getting so big that it exhausts its range. When the herd decreases, we can certainly use hunting pressure to make sure that we're not harvesting too many animals when a herd is depressed. But hunting is not really a successful tool at keeping the Western Arctic herd from crashing. And that may be also where we're at right now. So it's difficult to tell. In 2011, the estimate was about 325,000, and then we went and looked again this year in 2013. I actually got to still help with that, even though I'd already moved on to this workstation. And so we'll see what that estimate is going to be, but we're guessing it will probably be below 300,000, maybe around 285,000. So it's difficult to tell where to begin the story. Obviously, for a caribou, the story begins on the calving grounds when they're born. But for us, our relationship with an individual caribou begins when we put a radio collar on it. We've been using radio collars on caribou since about the 1970s. And in the early days, we lassoed caribou as they were swimming across the Kobuk River. But over time, we realized that the lassos really weren't necessary, and none of us were very good at rodeo. So we resorted to just using our outboard motors and motoring up to a caribou, calmly grabbing its antlers, holding it next to the boat, and putting on the radio collar. One of the reasons why we do things this way is that there's very little tolerance within the Inupiaq culture of Northwest Alaska for radio collars. People harvest caribou all year round. They do not like the idea of people using drugs on their food. Just like a lot of us like to eat organic meat. They don't want to eat animals that have potentially been drugged. They also do not like the idea of people using helicopters and potentially harassing animals. So they have asked us since the very beginning to use less invasive means. Also, when using drugs to anesthetize animals, there's a certain amount of risk and that you're going to kill the caribou or cause them undue stress. So we've been using this technique, and it allows us to process animals very quickly and send them on their way. I'm not going to tell you that it's without stress, because when we grab those animals, they are in the fight of their life. Some of them go immediately docile. They just hang in the water immediately. But some of them will try to knock your head off for the whole time. And it certainly can be a stressful experience, and we're very conscious of that, so we try to process them very quickly. So we try to maintain a radio collar sample of about 100 collars, but at times it's been almost as high as 150, especially since we have federal partners that like to contribute and buy collars as well. This equates to less than 0.1% of the herd being sampled. So our radio collars, in the whole scheme of things, are pretty insignificant relative to the size of the herd. So a lot of people keep asking us, well, okay, so if you've been radio collaring since the 70s, you know where these animals go. They go to the same places every time of year, with a high degree of predictability. Why do you need to keep putting radio collars out there? But the reason we put radio collars out there, a very small piece of that is to understand where animals go. A much bigger piece of that is that those animals that have collars become our sample size of the herd. And we use that sample size to get a variety of different population metrics that help us to tell what's going on, and they provide us a bit of a BS detector. We use all of these different tools to check any one tool against all the other ones and evaluate whether or not the story that it's telling us is probably credible. At first, we use straight VHF collars. So those collars emit a radio signal that can be picked up with a receiver. We fly in planes that have antennas on them, and we can locate caribou that way. But it's very reliant on people being able to get out, radio track those animals frequently. It relies on weather. And technology has just changed a lot. So now most of our GPS our radio collars have either GPS capabilities or they have a platform position transmitter, PTT. Platform terminal transmitters, that should say PTT, not PPT. Anyways, it doesn't matter. What you all need to know is it's a satellite collar. And so we can download locations that have been uploaded from that Caribou collar to a satellite. We get them. So now you can get a data flow on your computer, which has good things and bad things. I personally feel like scientists still need to get out of the office and not sit in our office and let a stream of data come in. But it allows us to get information in times of the year that it's just very difficult to get out there and do it. So I'll explain the process of collaring the caribou, but first I'll explain the timeline throughout the year that we look at these animals. So I call this collar, watch, and repeat. In September, we collar the animals on the Kobuk River, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But that's when the animals are in this pink area, the migration area. October, they're still in that migration area, and we do fall composition surveys during that time, although we're looking at changing that. Just to give you an idea of scale, this migration corridor that's shown in pink is about 38,000 square miles, so that's about the size of the state of Indiana. Winter is this blue zone here, and during that time period we are monitoring movement and mortality. We want to see how what they're using for winter range, evaluate the condition of that range, and look for dead caribou. We can do that because their radio collars switch to a different kind of signal when an animal is dead, and we can also see that with the PTT or GPS collars if they have one of those. So the size of the winter range is about the size of West Virginia. This blue is about the size of West Virginia. In April, we do short yearling recruitment surveys. So that's referring to is we want to see how many calves that were born in June have made it all the way to April. So they're just short of being a yearling, and we are considering them recruiting into the population. They've made it to adulthood at that point. So we want to get a metric of how many of those calves are surviving. Calves are obviously one of the more vulnerable components of your population. In June, we do calving surveys. We want to see how many of our cows with collars are having calves. And then in July, we use all of the collars to acquire our photocensus. So we want to see if we can account for all of our collars. There's a high chance that we're accounting for all the individuals in the herd. The collars are randomly distributed in the herd, and even though it's only it's less than 0.1%, it still is enough to get the distribution of the animals. And then in the summer, we look for missing collars, because if you had a missing collar in your photocensus and that counted for 50,000 animals, that would be a big deal. So the more collars that you can say, well, this collar was missing because it was dead, the better, and it increases the confidence intervals around your estimate. So I'll explain a little bit about onion portage. And onion portage is where we do the actual collaring. It's in this pink zone here. I drew a little X on it, which hopefully our Valdez folks can see. And it's a place that's been used by caribou since caribou began, basically. It naturally funnels animals through the landscape. You can kind of see that the Brooks Range has a little bit of a depression where those arrows come together, and it's naturally kind of funneling animals through the landscape. And as a result, there are caribou trails that have been used for 10,000 years. The oldest evidence of humans was in Kobuk Valley National Park for a very long time, until they found some older remains, I believe in South America. So because of its cultural, historical significance, and biological significance, this is all part of Kobuk Valley National Park in here. So yeah, the oldest evidence of humans on the continent was there for quite some time, and the humans were there because the caribou were there. And humans have been going there to hunt caribou for so long. That's why we could find hunting implements and evidence of them being there, human remains. And people still hunt there today. You could hunt in Kobuk Valley National Park if you're a federally qualified subsistence user. And so it's a very important component of how we do our work there, is that we have to be sensitive to the fact that people are trying to get meat for their freezer at the exact same time. And that bull that we have the intent to put a collar on, they may have an intent to put it in their freezer. And so do a dance with local subsistence users to make sure that everybody gets their needs met. So, where is Onion Portage? Well, it's on the Kobuk River, which this ended up being just a little bit dark for this room, but this map right here is the Baldwin Peninsula, so I'll back up. You can see the Baldwin Peninsula is kind of like an arm with a fist on it. And so just to the right of that, or just east of that, is the Kobuk River. And it goes all the way up here by the Kobuk Valley Sand Dunes. So this is part of Kobuk Valley National Park. These sand dunes are part of I believe a terminal glacial moraine that developed, and the glaciers are long gone. But it's kind of like the Sahara Desert in the middle of the Arctic. It's a very interesting place. So Onion Portage is right around here. This is that natural funneling down through the brooks. Kind of happens like this. So every year we go to Onion Portage, and this involves the crews assembling in Kotzebue. We end up with about 8 biologists. We go from Kotzebue to a village called Ambler, which is up the Kobuk River, and then we load up boats, and we haul all of our gear, which you can see is a lot of gear, down the river about 45 minutes, and then we hike up a big hill about a mile, and there's a cabin that was built in the 1920s to support an archaeological exploration there, and we use that cabin. It's now owned by the National Park Service. Another component of what we do at Onion Portage is we invite students from village communities within the range of the Western Arctic herd to come participate in the collaring project. So we actually get kids in boats out with us holding caribou, putting caribou collars on the caribou, and seeing what we do. And we feel like that's a very important part of just increasing awareness, gaining public support for what we do just through understanding. If people understand what you do and why you do it, they're much more likely to be supportive of that. Also, it fits in with Fishing Game's mission, which is to get kids outside, get kids engaged in the outdoors, and they're also able to share with us the importance of caribou to them, to their families, and kind of bring it all together. And so every year we'll have 5 to 10 students. We bring 2 different schools, so we'll switch schools halfway through the trip. Each school spends about 3 days there. So that's part of what we do too. So we motor down the river, and then once we get set up, we climb up onto the bank, and it's a lot of hurry up and wait. So we bust out the spotting scope and the binoculars and our snacks, and you just spend a lot of time glassing for caribou. The more lead time you have to know that caribou are going to go in the water, the better, because the mad scramble begins of people throwing on life jackets, and Murphy's Law is that you'll have your pants down in the bushes when the caribou come in the water. So we hurry up and wait. So this is what it looks like when the caribou walk out on the bar, and someone yells, "Caribou on the bar!" And then the mad rush ensues. We all jump in boats. Now the caribou are going in the water. These are the Jade Mountains in the background here, part of the Brooks Range. You can see these animals are starting to enter the water, and this is a phase where we're probably motoring to get ourselves in position to do what we need to do, and we're selecting which animals we're interested in at this point. So usually we would not take animals from the front of the herd because we don't want to do anything that's going to cause them to want to run back and forth. We want these animals to cross the river and continue on their migration like nothing ever happened, like this was just some weird alien abduction where they tamper with you just a little bit and send you on your way. But you can tell here, this is a cow, this is a calf, cow, calf. It's probably a young bull, cow, calf, bull, bull, bull. So you can pick what you wanted, and usually we'll pick something towards the back, and we'll cut out a group and allow the rest to pass. We'll work up those animals. So there are 3 boats. One boat will be committed to capturing the cow. One boat will be committed to capturing the calf. We want to keep the cow and calf together. For a long time, we just held the calf while we worked up the cow, but now we do some work on the calf too. And then that 3rd boat is kind of a support boat. It can take pictures. It can hand you a juice box if you're out in the middle of the river and things get dull again. Or it can actually hold animals in the water. These caribou can swim for a long time. They're very capable swimmers. So sometimes you will cut off a group and hold some extra animals in the water. And this is a lot of what I end up doing involves a lot of rodeo, because it's kind of like herding, which I guess they don't actually do in rodeo, but you have to use kind of a principle of opposing magnets, where you can't be too aggressive with animals because they're pretty dang maneuverable and they'll get away from you. But you just apply gentle pressure to move the animals where you want them to go. And the real challenging part is that in some years we're dealing with very low water. And if you have very low water, anybody who's driven a boat on a river knows all of a sudden you got gravel bars where you're not expecting them to be, and next you can be high and dry in just a couple seconds and not know what happened, and all of a sudden your chances of getting that group of caribou is gone.
So Charlotte, is that like the only spit, or are there spits all along here that they're kind of walking out on?
Oh, there are different, there are lots, it depends on the year and the water level, but yeah, there are lots of points of access. They could pop out of the bushes anywhere, and that's why we just have kids, and everybody's just watching for where they're going to pop out.
This is over 2 weeks, 3 weeks?
We spend 1 week at Onion Portage every year.
But the animals are actually passing over a month.
It just depends. In some years it's a very protracted, and in some years it's very compressed. It just really depends. What we're finding is that in recent years we're having these really warm falls, and the caribou are kind of waiting. They don't have a real reason to move to the winter grounds, so they're waiting, and they're waiting and waiting and waiting. This year was the latest year we've ever gone to Onion Portage. They didn't go until, I believe, usually we go the first week of September. I don't think they went until October this year. And as a result, we started dealing with the river freezing up. It finally did get cold. But the other thing we're dealing with, and this is another reason why climate change may kind of affect things a bit, is that this time of year, traditionally people are harvesting bulls. Bulls are what they want. Bulls are fat. You just got the biggest animals, and that's what they would be targeting. But about the second week of October, the bulls become unpalatable. They go through a physiological change in their meat, and they are stinky. And they call them stink bulls. And anyone who's ever shot one did not probably enjoy it very much. So as a result, people know that, and they switch their target to cows. And if anybody who watched my deer talk or read my article about goats in the newspaper knows that harvest of females has a very large potential impact to influence the trajectory of an animal population. So we've got this herd that's going down, and meanwhile we've got people that are killing more cows because they're not migrating till later, and those are the animals that are what they want and what they need, and it's almost a perfect storm. That's a very small piece of what's influencing this herd, but it's definitely a part of it too. So that's a very long answer to your question. It just depends. Sometimes it happens over the course of 2 months that they're trickling through. Sometimes it's just bam, 1 week, and they slam through, and hopefully you were there if you're a subsistence user and you need meat for your freezer. But our biologists are only there for 1 week. So here we got a nice group of what are probably girls. Sometimes you have to actually confirm the sex of the animal, because it's a big deal if you put a cow collar on a bull caribou. Every year the bulls will go through a hormonal change that really influences their neck size. And so if you put a cow collar and it does not have an expansion section in it, that animal will strangle to death. So when we get animals like these, we would double check, lift up the tail, see what you got going on, and make sure it's what you think it is. Those are probably cows. So how do you collar caribou? Well, collars are hung mostly on adult cows. And this is mainly because we get a whole bunch of information from looking at the ladies. We get parturition information, so we find out whether or not they have a calf. We can then follow them, find out how that calf's doing when we do the short yearling surveys later. Also, indices of adult cow mortality are real important to understanding population. It's one of the most commonly used metrics is adult cow mortality. And then these cows will just live a long time. We've had collars on animals for more than 10 years, 13 years. And then some of the jaws that we have collected have been 17 years old. So cows will just get a lot more bang for our buck, so to speak. You hang them on bulls, and you deal with the fact that they're just a whole lot more likely to die for a whole bunch of different reasons. They go into the winter with fewer fat reserves because of the rigor of the rut. And they also spend more time without their antlers, so they're more likely to slip a collar. The expansion section can wear out, although I'm told it really doesn't. I find that hard to believe, considering that the elastic in my pants will wear out over, not being exposed to the kind of elements that these collars are exposed to. But so we hang them on adult cows. That's a main focus of what we do. You can see here I'm reaching out to grab the scruff of the neck of that cow. Second biologist is coming behind me and grabbing her tail. We'll pull her up close to the boat. Meanwhile, one of these kids is going to throw out an anchor. And when that anchor is set, the boat will kind of swing with the current. The caribou will swing right up next to the boat. And usually they just hang. They just are like, well, this is it. So, but the actual process of grabbing the animal involves science and a little bit of rodeo. And I feel like one of my main skills that helped me to hone this technique is picking up water skiers. Not in this part, but in the boat driving part, because you've got to get close to the animal without hitting it. And growing up in New Mexico summers, I did a little bit of that. Yeah, so here we've got another biologist honing in. You can see the calf is right next to it on the left. That'll be picked up by another boat that's coming up behind it. The cow is about to get grabbed. This is Jim Dow. He's the lead caribou biologist for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, working on the Western Arc caribou herd. This other person here is actually the Teshekpuk herd caribou biologist, which maybe you all have heard about because of interest in developments on the Teshekpuk herd.
I see no freeboard.
Yeah, it's a little bit of.
Nobody's high siding.
It's some pretty high. I don't get hazard pay for this work, and it is definitely some of the more dangerous stuff I do. But, anyways, okay. So after you capture the animal, you don't go straight to getting their collar on them. One of the things we do is just a very qualitative assessment of body condition. So Jim, who's been looking at caribou for over 30 years, will look and say, I want to classify this as a skinny, a very skinny, an average, a fat, or very fat. And it's amazing how much that qualitative definition can tell you when it's been consistently collected by somebody for 30 years. So the other thing he does is he comes in here and he starts to draw a tube of blood. Anyone who's ever sat in the office and had a doctor's office and had a phlebotomist try to draw blood from your arm while you're sitting perfectly still and a willing participant, this is a pretty interesting thing to try to accomplish. You've got an animal that's probably could be fighting, could be docile, but is definitely not a willing participant, and luckily the thing you got going for you is a big vein. So the reason why we draw blood is because we can use that blood for indicators of population health. One of the things we monitor are haptoglobins, and haptoglobins are proteins that indicate inflammation. And we don't know what causes the inflammation, but we basically know that that animal is fighting something off. And so increased levels of haptoglobins generally mean they have some kind of infection. But we also test for specific viruses and bacteria, such as Brucella, rangifer herpes, chlamydia. Those are all things that people are interested in on a worldwide level at monitoring in ungulate species. Western Arc herd has a very low prevalence of Brucella. So a little more blood drawing here. The second one down below is how we draw from a bull. I'll explain a little bit more about capturing bulls in a second here. So we spend a lot of time laying down in the bottom of boats or crouching in the bottom of boats, and And so then we put on the radio collar. We have to size them, make sure that they fit appropriately, not too loose, not too tight. We have to kind of consider how old the animal is while we're doing that, make sure they've got room to grow if they need it. And then we send them on their way. But we don't send them on their way if they had a calf with them. We release both the calf and the cow at the same time. So while the workup was being happening on the cow, a second boat is picking up the water skier here, is grabbing that calf. And we weigh calves because female calf weights are a very reliable indicator of herd robustness. If you got big porky calves, then you're probably they're finding a lot of food. They're not spending too many calories in the summer range, getting harassed by bugs. So that's one of the metrics that we look at for caribou herds is calf weights. So this involves even more rodeo because you grab the calf, boat driver comes up, throws the anchor, then the boat driver comes and loops straps behind the front legs and in front of the back legs and then carabines them together. And then these two people do a clean jerk basically while standing on the boat seats, and you get yourself into a press here. These calves will weigh between 60 and 100 pounds. So I do a lot of shoulder presses for these beefcakes. It's not a big deal, but for me that's a big deal. So yeah, you weigh the calf, and then we tell, we write down how much the calf weighs and whether or not it's male or female. And then when both the cow and the calf are ready to be released, we release them together, and they run off into the sunset together. Pretty much always. Every once in a while we have a calf and cow that are having a little trouble getting back together, but we have a pretty high success rate for getting them together. I've never seen a pair not reunite, so. And then they're running into the bushes. Alright, so we also collar the bulls, and I'll show you some pictures of that. You can tell in the cow pictures that I've showed you before, the cows are mostly in velvet this time of year, whereas the bulls are mostly shed of velvet, which really helps out a lot because the velvet it'll just immediately slip off the antler. So if you reach out to grab one, all of a sudden you're just holding a strip of velvet and that's all you got. So the bulls are, since they're a little bit more to handle, it's kind of nice that they're generally out of velvet this time of year. I think they're actually maybe weighing a calf in the background here. So the bulls are pretty impressive, as you can see. It's one of my favorite pictures there. So this is how it works when you're capturing a bull. It's a little bit different than a cow. You motor up, grab an antler, and then both antlers are pulled into the boat. Kind of looks like it would hurt, but I don't think it really does. They're held there briefly until a second boat comes up, and then one of the antlers is handed off to that second boat. So now each boat has one antler in it, and you're just basically holding the caribou in a little squeeze chute. We have two people. The function of this person with their legs sticking out is to keep the boat from getting too close, but to keep it close enough that that animal feels secure. And once they're in there, it's just like you're handling them in a squeeze chute. So then we get them in there. We can draw the blood. We can put the radio collar on and send them on their way. So in some years we are really hard up to get all the animals that we need to deploy, all the collars that we want to deploy. But in other years we'll get all the collars out, and then we're still committed to be there for a couple more days, so we'll just draw blood from as many animals as we can to boost up that sample size and get that information. But the other thing we do at Onion Portage when there's nothing to do is we do jaw collections. So we have a voluntary jaw submission program where we ask people who are killing caribou to bring in caribou jaws, and we try to provide some incentives here and there for them to do that. But we can get a whole bunch of caribou jaws by going and rummaging through piles of heads at Onion Portage, because most of the people that hunt there, well, they have to be subsistence hunters because only federally qualified users can hunt in Cobo Valley National Park. Most of those people are not interested in the trophy value, so they'll just leave the head and they pile them in this big pile. We can use the jaws to get a variety of different pieces of information. One of them is that we can use the teeth. We can pull the incisors, and those can be cross-sectioned. Every year of their life, a caribou lays down an annuli, a cementum, that can then be aged like rings on a tree. And so we can do an age-structured analysis while considering that it's a selective sample because it's 100 killed animals. But we can use that to get a general age structure of the animals that are being harvested and the overall population. We can also look at the mandible length, and mandible length can be correlated. Mandibles are your jaws, those can be correlated with herd size and trajectory. So basically when your herd is really large, your individual animals can be smaller, and when your herd is really small, individual animals are bigger. So that's another thing we look at. We're comparing the data set we're collecting now with data that was collected in the 50s or in the 70s to understand where we're at with that. And then bone marrow can indicate body conditions. So bone marrow under normal circumstances looks kind of like cold butter. It's white, it's thick and greasy, but time an animal dies of starvation, it's like bloody snot, for lack of a more or less yucky definition. It just looks dark, dark red and slimy, gooey, and then there's a gradient of change in between them. So we can cut into the mandibles and see what their bone marrow looks like. And because not all caribou are taken in the fall, we get hunter samples from all throughout the year. We can use that to try to understand how the population's doing as far as getting its food needs met. So that means when we find that big pile, we all gotta buckle down and cut out jaws. And that pile has been there for days or weeks. And so we find many pleasant surprises crawling around in the caribou head. And it's the way that I keep grounded because I get to do so much cool stuff for my job and I get paid for it. This is when I pay my dues. It's when I handle maggots and things that are crawling away from me. You can see nobody's laughing and telling jokes right now. We're just buckling down. In some years we do health assessments, so we'll kill about 10 animals to evaluate their body condition. So I'd like to throw out a blood and guts warning, because I'm going to show some blood and guts. If you are queasy about these things, the next couple slides are probably not for you. In this picture we're weighing an adult caribou, so that's the first step of this process. We weigh the caribou and then we take it apart and measure every part and piece you can imagine. And so like this is an example of a nerve that runs down the animal's backbone. It's called the caudal mediastinal, and I have no idea why it's important, but the state veterinarian wanted it, and so I was involved in taking a sample of that. She takes all kinds of part and pieces. This is a brain that's being cut into for chronic wasting disease monitoring. So chronic wasting disease is found in ungulates in the lower 48. It's kind of like mad cow disease. It's similar to bovine encephalitis, which is the pathogen that causes mad cow disease, and it can be dangerous to humans. And I think in humans it's called Creutzfeldt-Jacobs syndrome or something like that. Anyways, it's an encephalitis. It causes you brain problems, and in the lower 48 they're having problems with deer populations and elk populations with chronic wasting disease. Nobody wants it to get to Alaska, so we're part of a disease surveillance program, and of course we haven't picked it up and we don't want to. One thing for people to consider on here, if you're deer hunters, is chronic wasting disease. They're real concerned about the use of deer urine from other parts of the world or this country. Using deer urine as a scent to attract deer while you're hunting, you can transmit the pathogen for chronic wasting disease into populations that don't have it. So keep that in mind if you're a deer hunter. I do not encourage you to rub yourself in deer urine for a whole bunch of different reasons. Wildlife diseases with global climate change are something that people are really interested in. It's one of the ways that we think the effects of global climate change will really manifest themselves. One example of this is winter ticks, and in Minnesota they're having real problems with their moose populations, and they're tracing it back to winter ticks, which didn't used to be prevalent there, but the winter conditions they're encountering now are allowing them to proliferate. In this case, the veterinarian has cut open an abomasum, and one of the cool things is that when we do all this work, we have the students around us, and so we're able to teach them about anatomy and physiology and talk to them about what we're seeing, and there's just so much that they can learn from that being a cultural site to biology, the caribou themselves, and then you get into this level, and there's just kind of something for everybody. So the state veterinarian has cut open the abomasum, and she's showing them evidence of ostrategia, which is a parasite that lives in the abomasum, and under normal circumstances it would barely complete one life cycle, but in these warmer summers and falls that we're having, they're actually able to complete multiple life cycles. And ostrategia can cause, it has its biggest effect on calves. It can influence their ability to intake food, causing weight loss, reduce pregnancy rates when it's time for them to be sexually mature. And so everybody's worried about ostrategia, and she was just pointing out the evidence of that in the abomasum. So here is the state veterinarian and me. We're collecting samples samples looks like a lymph node. There's a lot of rules about how these things are handled, maintaining sterility. I've got a vat of alcohol here and a little torch, and I was flaming her tools for her in between sample collections and maintaining sterility while she puts stuff in little bags and labeling things, and everything has to be just so. It's kind of stressful work, but it's important for disease monitoring. So then in the evening, we try to burn off some steam. We cook dinner for the whole group. That involves a lot of time, but then the other thing we do is we kind of look for where the animals are in the distance to try to anticipate what the next day is going to be like. And then also just to take beautiful pictures. And that time of year, it's beautiful to be in the Jade Mountains. The Jade Mountains are part of the Ambler Mining District, which is currently being considered for a future development. There's talk of punching a road from the Dalton Highway into the Ambler Mining District, and it would be the first road that would run perpendicular to caribou migration. People bring up the Dalton Highway as an example of how highways and caribou can get along fine. That's still debatable, but even when you look at it, that road is parallel to caribou migration. There's some work that's being done looking at caribou in reference to just the small little 40-mile piece of road that helps support red dog right now. And what it's showing is that the caribou are very hesitant to cross it, and they'll actually deflect and burn energy. They'll spend a lot of time north of that road before they finally commit to crossing it, and then they have to put on the gas to get to the winter range. So everybody's thinking a lot about what the Ambler Mining District might mean for western Arctic caribou. So in the evenings, we take the blood that we've collected during the day. We have hauled these batteries that weigh like 30 pounds up the hill. And we hook it up to a centrifuge and spin it down. The blood will naturally separate. And we used to just let it naturally separate. But veterinarians are greedy. They want the maximum amount of serum. So they have us spin it down, and then we separate it because the serum is what they want. That's where you get all the indicators of an immune response. So, and then sometimes we even get this little substance called Buffy coat, which is a component of blood, and you can get really special things out of that too. So then we have to slurp out the serum and put it in special vials, make sure it's labeled appropriately, and get all that worked up. And so there's a little bit of lab work in the evening in our primitive little cabin here. And you can see these guys from Buckland, students that are observing that process too. So here's Onion Portage, a little bit of termination dust, mostly bulls. It's just a gorgeous place. And that one is heading on its way. So that's all I wanted to tell you about Onion Portage. After Onion Portage, the caribou are moving through that pink area. They're on the move to the the winter range. And so one thing we want to look at, since this herd is hunted upon, is and most people are selecting, and they're often selecting for bulls, we want to make sure that we are maintaining enough bulls in the population so that all the cows can get pregnant, or the majority of the cows can get pregnant. When your bull-cow ratios get low, it can cause real problems, and bulls have a higher rate of mortality anyways, so it's something to always keep an eye on. So you can see this line of caribou. They're just single file. It's not always that way, but sometimes it is. We use the radio collars to find groups of animals. We use a cover aircraft, which is usually a PA-18 or PA-12 to find the collars, and then we use an R-44 helicopter to find a collared animal and then get the composition information for 200 animals that are in close proximity to that animal. So we're basically looking for bulls, looking for cows, looking for calves, looking for cows, and it's pretty furious work on the tallywhacker. Animals are radio tracked for distribution. We want to observe the range condition and find mortality signals. We're actually looking at moving this work into the summertime, because in the fall these animals can be sex segregated, and that can really influence your results, whether or not you're coming upon all groups of bulls or cows or whatever. So one of the things we're looking at is we mounted a GoPro on one of those planes, PA-12 or PA-18, and started making passes above big groups of caribou that are in the post-calving aggregations, and then counting collecting herd by doing sections of video. We can mount the camera on either the cabane V or the strut, and that's looking really promising for helping us deal with sex segregation. So then once they get to the winter range, they're basically just trying to eke it out in the winter conditions. And this year they were kind of in the periphery. This is 2010. They were in that gray area that is not their core winter range, but they were in there that year, and that's why there's all these spruce trees around. Usually they're not in an area that has so many spruce trees.
What's a GoPro?
A GoPro is like a tiny little video camera that a lot of kids are hooking up to their helmets now to go skiing and skateboarding and take footage of themselves doing things. It's just a tiny little video camera that's really high resolution and a fisheye lens.
Primitive me. Thank you.
No, you're good. Okay, so after they've spent their time on the winter range, they start their move north, and we need to give our calf recruitment surveys before they really put the gas on. So we go down, we find collared animals, we get the composition on 200 animals in proximity to them, and what we found is that we are seeing increased adult cow mortality, so increased numbers of our collared cows are dying, and at the same time we're seeing our short yearling recruitment going down. So basically our withdrawals are exceeding our deposits, and that's part of why we see this 4 to 6% annual decline. It comes right down to exactly what goes on with your checkbook. So we're spending more than we're putting in. So after they move up from the winter range through that migration corridor, and then they go up into the calving area. And the calving area, well, I'll show you that map again in just a minute here. The calving area is about the size of New Jersey. Collared cows are found, and then we determine whether or not they have a calf, and then we also note their antler and udder status. So we see here we got 2 calves. On the top one, the calf is up to the right of her head. It's for the Valdez folks that can't see my laser pointer. And on the bottom one, the calf is just to the left of her shoulder. This one on the bottom, this cow on the bottom has both hard antlers, whereas the cow on the top has 1 hard antler. So in the fall, after the breeding period, most of the bulls are going to drop their antlers, and they'll just be slick heads until they start growing a new set of antlers in the next spring. But the cows retain their antlers, and they retain them all through the winter, and they retain them right up until they drop their calf. So when we go to a radio-collared animal, if we get to her and she has new soft growth with velvet on it, we know that she probably was never pregnant. If she has a slick head, it may mean that she already had her calf and she lost that calf, or it could mean that she never grows antlers. So we would look at the records for her. Slick-headed cow gets a little bit more consideration, but usually it means she doesn't have a calf. Either she had it and it's gone, or she never had one. Hard-antlered cows, if we go to them and they don't have a calf yet, we revisit them, and they almost always eventually have a calf with them. So I was reading today about the calving surveys we did, I think in 2011. We went and returned to 23 hard-antlered cows, and 17 of them ultimately had a calf. So we use antler status to try to figure out whether or not they just haven't dropped one yet, udder status to tell also if they have been pregnant or not. These calves are hours to days old. It's pretty incredible work to get paid to do. It's just basically me. It was me and the Caribou biologist, and we would go to this 10 by 15 room windowless shack north of the Brooks Range, base out of there to do our surveys, and all day long you're just radio tracking caribou and looking at caribou that are just days or hours
So you're
old.
walking, or
We're in Super Cub.
a super?
So here's another picture of some of those calves. You can see almost every cow in this picture has a calf. There's one here that's a yearling. This one doesn't look to have a calf. And this one I think is also a yearling. It has a pretty short face. So that's pretty good calf production there. And you can see all of these cows don't have antlers anymore. So there's that. Another good picture of caribou and calves. these cows again have a calf at heel. Caribou almost never have twins. I don't think anybody's observed a caribou have twins and live through that ordeal. So if you see one that looks like it has two with it, it's just another calf is a little more bold than it probably should be. But basically when you're flying over these groups of animals, it looks like someone took handfuls of rice and just scattered them on the tundra because they're just animals as far as you can see anywhere you let your eyes focus. There are caribou. So it's a pretty impressive act of nature. Obviously calf production is an important component in the trajectory of the herd. So we're looking at that, and what we're seeing is that we're not seeing any big red flags with our calf production. Its survivorship seems to be the bigger problem. So then after they calve, those cows regroup with the males and they head over to the summer range. And the summer range is about the size of Ohio. I'll give you that map again in a minute here so you can see what we're talking about. But you can see that what these animals are basically trying to do is just get away from bugs. And they do that by getting where it's cold and where it's windy and where they have safety in numbers. Basically, the more animals you pack into an area, the more chances that they'll overwhelm the bugs. And it's kind of a bit of like a predator saturation concept. So to do this project, we based out of a place called Eagle Creek. It's just north of the Brooks Range. And it has this 10 by 15 foot shack with no windows that is the same shack that we would stay in to base the calving surveys. And then we set up 3 wall tents or weather ports. And we use 1 for a cook shack and 2 for sleeping tents. And this is one of the planes coming in to land. This is the Beaver. And the state's been using this plane since the 70s. It has a port that the camera can look out of. And then it will fly and take pictures. We use a pretty primitive camera right now because it's the camera that will give us the photos of the resolution that we need. And we're looking at moving to digital technology, but to get the level of digital camera that we need a legislative appropriation. So we're trying to get that right now. This little tent here is how you would load it with film. So this Beaver, what happens is we have 2 planes that are tandem aircraft with PA-18 and PA-12, and we have a C-185. And the 185 has the longest range and it's the fastest, so it's the one that we use to find callers that we really are having trouble finding. The other 2 planes are just radio tracking animals that are trying to account for where everybody's at, how many animals are associated with them. And then they're communicating that information to the Beaver, and then the Beaver will go to those groups and photograph them. So there's a lot of careful note keeping, make sure we know which callers are associated with which groups. And then we use technology. We use something called PhotoMan, and that basically tracks how the camera is taking pictures and how the overlap is between transects of photos. It'll tell you if you need to fly transects that are closer or farther apart. If you get them too close, then you waste a lot of film, and it's very tricky to draw overlap lines. But if you get them too far, then you might not have complete coverage of all the caribou. So we use computer software, pretty specialized computer software to do that. So photocensus success, it relies on the ability to account for the majority of your callers. Again, if you have a collar and it's missing and it could potentially have 50,000 caribou associated with it, that's a big deal. But if you can rule out that animal as a dead animal, then you know that the precision of your estimate is probably pretty high. This is Jim. This is the guy that monitors the Western Nordic caribou herd, a close personal friend and a mentor of mine. He has a very good understanding of the weather up there. He's also a very lucky person, and he also affiliates himself with a very good support team. He gets the whole region staff, which is everybody from Bethel up to Barrow, convenes on the photocensus to make this project happen. So we are dealing with really squirrely weather because you have coastal fog and wind up in the mountains, and you have to kind of anticipate how all of that's going to come together. And then you also need to make sure that the caribou are aggregated hard enough, because if the weather is cool, this year for example, the weather was cool and the caribou just kind of dispersed. They didn't need to be together. So the best condition is hot and buggy, which usually those of us that aren't in a plane are shoveling on the runway because the runway is being overtaken by the tundra. So we're out there using hand tools to repair one runway, and if the bugs are nasty and it's hot, you know it's looking good for doing a shoot. But if you're cool while you're doing that and there's a nice breeze, you're just hating it because you'll never get done. So you can see the back of my head here. I do not have the safety in numbers that the group of caribou does. Basically, if there are a whole bunch of animals together, it spreads out the pain. Everyone's trying to be where it's less buggy, and so they end up on coastal areas, mountains, and snow patches.
These are all flies?
Nope, mosquitoes.
Mosquitoes.
Yeah. There are different flies that affect caribou, ostrich flies, nose bots, and all kinds of good stuff, but these are just straight up mosquitoes. So this is what you get. I like this picture because I could kind of give you an idea of how the overlap lines work. So basically what you have to happen is you have a number of photos in sequence, and you basically have to figure the start and stop point for every photo. And so what you want to end up with is one box, but it will often be some kind of odd-shaped blob. So like I would start at the top point of this snow patch because I would be able to recognize it on two photos, and I'd make everything to the right of it on one photo and everything to the left of it counted on the other photo, and then I would go up to this green patch here, and then I'd go down to this brown patch, and then down here, and then I would find this snow patch on the other photo and make it, everything to the left is counted on this photo, everything to the right is counted on the next one. So you get that. So overlap lines have to be very carefully drawn. We do that. Throw out picture photos that we don't need because they're accounted for in other places, and then we ship all those photos off to a guy who lives in Ambler and is a retired gentleman that thinks this is the funnest thing to do ever, and he counts these caribou with a little monocular. And I've done a lot of caribou counting myself as a cross-checking mechanism, and just because it's a good experience and a good thing to learn how to do. And you definitely go cross-eyed, especially on these snow patches. You can tell sometimes you're looking at animals, but sometimes you're looking at shadows of animals, and sometimes their calves can be standing in their shadows, and like you can make yourself crazy real fast. But that's how it's done. So I'll just keep showing you a couple GWOW photos, but I think my remote is hung up. Here, let's go back. Come on. You get the idea, the caribou, and just how many there are. I'm hanging, my caribou, my slide is hanging here. Wait for it.
So do we need to go back to the computer to make
It's catching up, it's just doing it slowly. Okay. So this photo, I'm going to just show you a progression of photos where we zoom in, give you an idea. So if you look at this mountain here, at the brightest mountain for the Valdez folks, to the right of that, there's a bunch of caribou on top of that mountain. And then those caribou extend all the way down the ridge line. They actually trickle down here. You can see little dots of caribou coming down off this hill. They also reach out into the valley behind the mountain and all the way to the river. And you can see all these game trails right here. Those are all caribou game trails. And then these are all caribou right here on this bend of the river. Just north of that bend on the river, Valdez folks, those are all caribou. So now I'm going to zoom in on that, on this bunch right here, north of the river. Alright, so we're a little bit closer now. You can see those game trails again. You can see that this is just all caribou wrapping around this hill and going back in here. I'm going to zoom in a little closer. You can see they're crossing the river on the right side of the footage here. Now this next view is going to change the direction of it a little bit. Here they are crossing the river again, and it's just a swarm. And then there's one more a little bit closer.
So when you're counting the caribou with a photo like that, how do you know when you counted one and you don't count twice?
When you're counting, you lay a sheet of Mylar that has a grid on it, and then each grid has a number use that as a cross-reference as you go. You just have to carefully slide and just have a high degree of focus and tallywhacker and just click, 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 click down that grid. And then move over one grid and back up. And it's, again, it's part of my job that makes it to where I'm like paying the dues for all the fun stuff I get to do when I spend time counting photos like this.
And that can't be automated somehow?
There's talk about it, but it's not. You know, sometimes they'll use like satellite imagery to count walrus or something like that. But nobody's found anything that could work for these guys. And the confidence intervals associated when you introduce that kind of technology generally make it where it's pretty, it has less precision than this technique, even though this seems like it would introduce a lot of human error with it. And then there's also just a high degree of confidence in from our stakeholders when they know that somebody laid their eyeballs on those caribou and counted them.
What about infrared cameras? Would they work or no?
I don't know that you'd have, I don't know if you'd be able to pick up individual animals from each other. I think it would be like the walrus thing where you'd be relying on pixelation and assuming that a pixelation of a certain size correlates with animals, and it just introduces a whole other fudge factor layer in there. But at least since we've been counting things the same way since the 1970s, and most of the time it's been counted by the actual same guy. Most of the time the same biologist has collected it, the same guy's been doing it. We do have some consistency offered to us by that. Okay, so here's that range map again, just for a refresher. So this yellow areas where we just, or sorry, the green areas where we just were in the summer range, in the aggregation, so they're getting up high in the Brooks Range or they're getting on the coast here. This yellow part is where they were when they were calving. This pink part is where they migrate through when they're on the way to this blue part, the winter range. So now we've followed them for a whole year. We would then again be preparing for our collaring surveys in September and getting ready to start the whole process all over again. So, does anyone have any more questions?
When they're having their calves,
Mm-hmm.
do you ever just like go and observe the calving process?
Well, you know, we have definitely, there have been times that we've been going back to a cow because she had hard antlers and we hadn't seen her with a calf yet. And I've seen cows that were giving birth at that time.
Right, that was my question.
Yeah, you can see the calf coming out. At that point, our concern is that we don't want to have any negative impact on that. She's already, the cow that I saw that was actually in the process of birthing seemed stressed because I don't think things were going very good for her. And so as soon as we figured out what was going on, we got out of there. Because our super cub buzzing above her could just
Oh, no,
add
my
insult to
question
injury.
was, I mean, like me, I'm standing here watching you.
Mm-hmm.
Have you done that?
Oh, just like land the plane and watch them?
Well, or walk or both,
Yeah.
whatever, but I mean, just stood there and physically examined their calving and all this.
Yeah. I have not done that. I've definitely observed lots of caribou from the ground. One year, Jim and I, it was not a photosynthesis year, but we landed on one of the old mining strips, and the caribou were aggregating very close to there, and we watched them for a long time during the aggregation. There aren't a lot of places to land. That area on the north slope is very soggy, tough tundra to do anything in. So the only time we can ever land is on a gravel bar, and then the chances of seeing a birth in process are pretty low. Jim's observed it a lot because he used to work with reindeer as well before he took this job that he has now. He worked with reindeer herders in Nome, so he's been involved a lot with that. And he was the one who told me that the only time he ever saw Ranger fur produce twins, she died in the process. So. Kenny?
When you talked about bringing students in to help, I guess I assumed they were college students from down south, but these are local kids, right?
High school kids from local villages. We go through a rotation, so we ask communities, which one wants to get on the docket to go, and usually there's a waiting list. And we try to do it in such a way that they can share flights. So, one will fly there, and back. They can backhaul,
recruitment of the kids into state jobs or into fishing game, you know, having done this?
A little bit. Actually, my replacement at fishing game is from Kotzebue. The man who replaced me grew up in Kotzebue, went to high school there, had Jim Dow come into his classroom and talk to him, and inspired him to be a biologist. Went off, got educated, and came back to his community. He's married to a local girl. They're raising their kids there. They got both sets of parents there. It's the ideal situation. I don't think he ever went to Portage. I don't think Kotzebue went during those years. But there is a little of that. There's a problem with brain drain in the Northwest Arctic that a lot of kids that go off and get educated they will work for NANA or they'll work for they'll work on issues that are pertinent to that region, but they'll do it from Anchorage. Or they'll work at Red Dog, but they'll work based out of Anchorage. And so there's less motivation. But, I see those kids around, and maybe sometimes one of them, for example, works at the Village IRA, and he sells hunting licenses and issues the permits to people. It's helpful to me that he knows what I do and how we do it. And so even though he's not working for Fish and Game, he's still kind of involved in that process, and it's helpful. Not as much as I'd like to see.
Charlotte, what's the subsistence take? I mean, how many can each family take?
Okay. Any person that's licensed to hunt caribou, that's a state resident, can shoot 5 a day. Me, you, if you're an Alaska resident, you can shoot 5 a day. If they're a federally qualified subsistence user, they can shoot 15 a day on federal land. The reason why those bag limits are that liberal is because subsistence cultures depend on being able to make hay when the resources are there, knowing that tomorrow they may not. And not tomorrow like the long haul, but like, if you went hunting tomorrow, you might not be able to get them, and so you need to go when they're there. But those bag limits are set as such because nobody takes 5 a day. The annual take of all the villages within the range of the Western Arctic is about 15,000.
I have 2 questions.
Okay.
You said the subsistence hunters don't like when you guys drug them. Why and when do you drug them?
Well, we don't drug them. That's why we use the boats and just motor up to them and grab them. We don't use any drugs in that process.
Oh, okay. My second question is, how do the colors work for determining population?
Okay.
Just taking pictures.
So we use those collars to find the groups of caribou, the big aggregations. And then also, if we're missing collars, that means there are possibly missing animals from those aggregations. And so we need to find those collars or determine that they're dead. And so once we've found all these groups of caribou, and we can reasonably assume, because we've found all the collars, that we've accounted for everything that's out there, then we shoot the herd with photographs and count those photographs, and that's how our estimate comes. But if you're missing collars, all of a sudden you get wider confidence intervals for that estimate, because you could be missing animals.
So do you then wind up counting presumably all of the caribou when you do your picture counts?
All the photos, yeah, are counted, every single one.
Wow.
And then we cross-check against the counter. Jem will count photos, and I would count photos, and then we would use that to determine if we were statistically the same. That's what we came up with.
What percentage of the herd do you think actually ends up being counted, having this picture taken and getting counted?
That's it. As far as we can tell from the collars, we're doing a really dang good job. But, you don't know what you're missing because you missed it.
Well, would you also potentially be biased because you're only out there 1 week a year? Or do they mix and mingle that much, even though you're only catching that week's great caribou?
Okay, so I think Marianne's asking if the fact that we only collar in 1 week of time means that we are not getting a randomly distributed sample in the herd.
Right.
And the best indications we have are that after we collar them, we don't consider the locations for almost a full year because of that segregation in time. But once they've been in the winter range, they mix, they move north, they mix, and we've never seen any sign that they're not evenly distributed. So there's been talk about that over the years and how maybe we should try collaring in other places, but logistically, onion portage makes sense for a whole bunch of reasons. It funnels the maximum number of animals through in the most reliable time period, and we can do it in a way that's sensitive to the concerns of local users. And so we haven't found any compelling reason to think that we need to distribute those collars differently. Mm-hmm.
Do they have anything this extensive for the eastern herd? That's the porcupine herd, right?
Yeah, the porcupine caribou herd uses the same techniques. All the caribou herds throughout the state use the same techniques for the most part. Some caribou herds don't have, like they don't require the use of beaver because they don't have very many animals and they don't require very many collars and they just don't have to use something as big. But we all pretty much use the same technique, and the porcupine is one of them. The porcupine has had trouble though getting routine counts, but they did get one this year, and they did get one a couple years ago too. So yeah, it's being monitored in the same way with the same principles. But it's just a little bit more difficult. And one of the things about it is, you know, because we all go to Eagle Creek and we're stuck there for 2 weeks, we're all highly invested in getting that done. And we've got everybody there, and we're all focused on that objective. Some of the problems they have with other herds is that they're basing out of a big urban metropolis, and then next thing you know, like scheduling conflicts and this thing, it just, and then somehow you don't get the group cohesiveness and the big like let's rally and make this happen, I think. But for some reason the Western Arc herd seems a bit more conducive to getting photocensus done.
That's the largest herd?
Yep. Any other? Okay, so if any of you do want the nitty gritty about caribou, I highly recommend going to our website. On our website you can find our survey and inventory reports about caribou, and they can give you all kinds of information about kernel analysis that we do with the data, and confidence intervals and blah blah blah. If you ever want more information, that's where Jim's report he writes every 2 years is kept. If you have trouble finding that,